Hello there, men, and welcome to the Masculinism Movement channel, a place for men to be men and to talk about masculinity and men's issues. I'm your host, Brian Krall, and today I want to talk with you about the concept of manliness and manly things. And what are manly things? What things are manly and what things are not manly? And who is the man who is manly enough that he is the one that gets to say what is manly? When it comes to talking about manliness and manly things, there's a lot of men out there who like to say to other men that if they were more like them, they'd be more manly, masculine, or more of a real man. And, another one of my favorite phrases, as I talked about in a previous video. If you haven't seen that, the link is right there below, so check that out. But these men love to preach about how a manly man is someone who is into this, not that. They may then try to justify their own personal preferences and opinions with masculinity. This is what a man does. A manly man is into these sports. A manly man eats meat, or even a full carnivore diet now is what they're saying. A manly man lifts heavy weights. You don't want to lift light weights, otherwise that's not masculine, that wouldn't look manly enough. Oh, and a manly man has to drink whiskey and smoke cigars. Actually, I should grab a glass of whiskey just to prove to you that I own it, that I'm a manly enough man to own and drink whiskey. There's just so many men saying that in order to be manly, you have to be into these kinds of interests and preferences, right? And then they can say that the things that they are not into or the things that they dislike is because those things are not masculine. Anyone who does them is effeminate. They just basically try to emasculate anyone who's into those things. And, like all the references that I just gave you for examples there, that comes out of the cultural influence of America, where I live. But these things, of course, will vary from culture to culture, and each culture will have its own version of it. Different cultures prescribe different masculine archetypes, which then turn into stereotypes of masculinity in that culture. So when we take into consideration this international cross-cultural scope here, where we can look at all of the different cultures, versions of masculinity and what, is considered masculine, how varied it is throughout the world. And we ask the question, is there a most manly culture or religion or political party or counterculture or, career or diet or demographic? And the answer is no, absolutely not. You're not going to be achieving the pinnacle of masculinity by going far right and becoming a Bible-toting Christian and adopting the carnivore diet any more than you could say that in order to achieve full masculinity, you must join the army and fight in a war, or do anything else, right? Someone like me could say that the most masculine things you could do would be to pump iron. 5 reps. And shred heavy metal guitar. I used to think of masculinity as being exemplified by virility and fucking as many women as possible. And now I think of it as being sexually stoic and practicing celibacy, basically living a monastic lifestyle. While other men say that the purest sexual manifestation of masculinity is through marrying and having a family with one woman. So masculinity as a gender is something that is biologically universal. We know that all men are men because they have male genitalia. But when it comes to the psychological archetypes, those are, less universal. There are certainly some universal masculine archetypes, sure, but there are going to be some variances in what masculinity is considered to be, culture to culture, and, demographic to demographic. And in one culture, you might have one slightly different expression of a slightly different version of what we could call masculine polarity, and the expression of that becomes even more specific and specialized when it is confined to certain demographics and niches within that culture, such as counterculture or smaller organizations and groups. So take, for instance, the differences between certain very hyper-masculine groups, different groups that we would say have a lot of masculine polarity or on one far end of the spectrum, right? Such as the super masculine or even macho men of the Italian Mafia, right? Versus the masculine men who live as martial artists and monks, like the Shaolin Kung Fu monks that live at the Shaolin Temple in China. versus the masculine men you would find as sailors on board an oil tanker, versus the types of masculine sailors you'd find on a warship, versus the super masculine men you would find on a sports team in any number of different sports, all of whom are going to be very different, right? Due to the cultures that they come from and the types of sports they are playing, they are going to be very different, all right? Think about the types of masculine men you would find owning different types of businesses, right, versus politicians, and the types of super masculine men you would find then at the bottom of society in the criminal class, like living in prison gang culture. And you could compare even just two broader cultures, like the macho men of the machista culture of Mexico and the cold, icy macho men of Russia or Scandinavia or Eastern Europe. Right? All of these are good examples of masculinity and how it can express itself so differently, even when it is being expressed fully. And though we like to think about masculinity as being archetypal and universal, and I've talked about the archetypes of masculinity plenty, it certainly shows up very differently in different cultures and even social scenarios. So you see, masculinity is a multifaceted phenomenon. It is not homogeneous, it is multidimensional, and there is not one dimension of it that represents its truest form, and that which every man in the world must be like in order to be masculine, right? In the purest, truest, most ideal way, or to be a real man, right, or a manly man. There's too many variations in the concept of what masculinity is between the cultures, so there's also going to be variances in the types of values that go along with that, right, and the interests and preferences as well, and the types of things that are considered manly for men to do in those cultures. So these values tend to be very relative, as some men may say, one thing is masculine but not this other thing, whereas they could be thought of the opposite way around by another man. So, for instance, a Latin American man may view cooking as a feminine activity and dancing as a masculine activity, whereas I look upon dancing as the feminine activity and cooking as the masculine activity. And when I see one of these supposed manly men in Latin American culture dancing, I do not think he looks masculine. I think he looks more effeminate, kind of silly, maybe even a bit like a pussy, right? And then I also view the fact that they rely upon their mothers for food still as adults, or upon their girlfriends, like they rely upon women to cook for them as adult men. It just makes them seem childish, like little girls to me. But in their culture, they are the so-called macho men. So, that's just one example of how relative it could be that, they are macho men in their culture, and yet I look on them as being, kind of effeminate, not certainly what I would consider to be an exemplary masculine man, like a man's man, a man that I want to be like. But of course, most men do like to think of themselves that way, as the ultimate manly man, or the ideal man's man, or however they want to think of themselves. And one of the ways that they help themselves feel that way and cope with other men not being like them is by emasculating them. So we've all heard men calling other men feminine, or maybe even had ourselves be emasculated by other men and called feminine in some way, for having certain interests that the other person didn't regard as masculine, or whatever it may be. Maybe not so much as adults, but we all heard the term, like that's for girls, or we're called a girl for doing certain things at certain times when we were growing up. Society in general just loves to emasculate men for a number of reasons, because people feel threatened by strong men and strong masculinity, which is a very powerful thing. So, of course, society in general is always trying to stifle us. But then it's also always trying to put us into a box, right? And we also all live in a culture where there is a social construct of masculinity that we are socially conditioned and culturally programmed into. And so what you get is a culture whose narrative is constantly telling you as a man that you have to be like this and you have to do this, and you're not, manly, or you're not a real man if you don't. And then what you get is a lot of men who develop a complex about this, and thus they overcompensate, as someone does with an inferiority or superiority complex, like a Napoleon complex, which I talked about before in my video on Macho Men. Make sure you've seen that. If you haven't, the link is there below. And so what you get is a lot of men trying to become hyper masculine to overcompensate, like to be very macho and deny anything feminine, or to fit into some sort of masculine cultural meme or stereotype, conform as much as possible. And these men then will put down anyone else who doesn't and say they're not being manly and act as though they are so confident in their own masculinity when they aren't. They're actually very insecure about their masculinity, which is why when they see someone not conforming to the same cultural norms that they are, they'll say things such as, oh, what you're doing isn't manly. Manly men do what I'm doing or whatever. What this cultural relativity has shown us is that most things can be made manly if they are done by a masculine man in a manly sort of manner. All right, but when it comes to men telling men that what they do is what a manly man does, and anyone who does differently is not manly or not a real man or something like that, well, that is just a narcissistic, feminine manipulation tactic. It's the type of thing that women do. All right, so it is very unbecoming of a man, ironically enough, but that is just representative of how they are insecure about their masculinity and want to feel better about it by trying to shame others into conforming to being like them and saying things to make them feel insecure like they do, unless they conform. Right? But you do not have to play the sports that are popular in your culture or listen to the pop music of your culture or play any of their social games or abide by their customs and traditions or any of that in order to be a manly man. You do not have to conform to anything that anyone says is what a man is supposed to be or do. You're allowed to be your own man and define what masculinity means to you and what you want to do with your life as a man. Every man is allowed to have his own masculine identity and manner of expressing it, and their own masculine preferences, values, ethics, interests, passions, pursuit, work, hobbies, politics and other causes, opinions and ideas, life philosophy, etc. And you as a man should be independent enough from groupthink and the matrix to be able to choose what masculinity and being a man means to you and how you are going to live your life and express your masculinity to the world. You need to have the independence and freedom to be your own man, have your own sovereign identity, and decide what type of man you want to be in life. You do not have to allow people to influence you with propaganda and tell you who you should be or how you should live. Manliness is about having the strength to be your own man and be independent. Manliness is about independence because it is about being your own man. All right, and there's nothing more manly than doing whatever the fuck you want to do. And when you have that kind of confident, proactive, alpha male attitude about it, then you make everything that you do manly. So that concludes this talk. Thank you for listening. Be sure to share your own thoughts and opinions on what manliness means to you and what types of manly things you are into by commenting below. And thanks for listening. I hope I mansplained that good enough for you. If you like what you heard, please click the like button. And if you feel you gained some value from this video and would like to give some back, please do so with the PayPal link below because your support helps fund me doing this work and fight the good fight for men like you. If you are ready to take the red pill and wake up from the matrix and the matriarchy controlling it and learn everything you need to know about female on male sexism, get your copy of my newly released book called Misandry Exposed. On sale now for a special price that won't last long. So check it out by clicking the link below. And otherwise, take care of yourselves, men, because no woman out there is going to.